All right, so I'm recording and we're going to admit all. And as we have folks coming in here, welcome to the Artfare Thursday night studio visits. We've been going strong since the beginning of March. I'm Carolina Wheat, Artfare Curator, and tonight I'm talking to Ivan Rios-Fetchko. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. And we actually have you in your studio tonight, which is a real treat.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't quite see, people are coming in, and I guess, welcome to the studio, or at least the desk corner of my studio. I'm glad to have people by for the interview studio visit. We maybe can get up and go around after, but
We're going to do it. We're going to do it. We're really glad to have you on Artfare. Ivan, I discovered you on Artfare actually, and I'm wondering like what brought you onto the app, or what were you hoping, like when you saw it, like tell me a little bit about that.
Artfare I found out through some friends who are on it as well, and they, back, this was maybe a year, 9 months ago, I think it was, not in LA yet. And, these are friends in New York, and they were trying it out and they were saying it's great, precisely this kind of like the way that the Zoom is, people are all over and they can tune in, and they said the same about Artfare. And when it opened up here, I applied, and it's been great to be on it, meet new people, and also see new work. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean the discovery section, as we talk about a lot, behind the scenes, like it really, for as a curator that also runs a gallery and works with other artists and just all around in support of getting art out there and having art accessible to everyone. COVID really like put a wrench in a lot of art fairs plans, a lot of like, shows that revolve around opening receptions, or that are, obviously exhibition of work is paramount to a lot of artists' practice. We want to be able to share the work, and we've kind of just resorted to these moments of Zoom and these kind of really lovely transactions between two people on Zoom, like we're doing right now. But what I'm seeing behind you is, some of the things that I've seen on the app. I think in particular, the works with the liquor store and these like Russia-esque kind of skies, and I know you had mentioned that you really appreciate Neil in some ways, your brushstrokes and things, and I think that was one of the first things I was attracted to, is how you were taking these landscapes but then placing them in context of the American landscape. I was hoping that you would talk a little bit about your sunsets and your interest and kind of prosaic thoughts about them.
Well, yeah, I mean, the liquor stores and city scenes are the newest kind of iteration of the work. And I've been painting landscapes for a few years now, and always interested in the American West. I grew up in LA, and this kind of, in this westward looking space, which is a strange place to exist in as we begin to reflect on what the American legacy actually is, and what the land, the history that it carries, and so on. And so the landscape has always been important for me as a place where time passes, where things occur. And, doing a lot of drives around the Western United States and working from those images was great. But when I got back to LA about 2.5 years ago, I realized I had to approach the landscape in a different way. And thinking about time passing in the landscape in the LA context really led me to these strip malls, which are such kind of transient spaces. Both you go to them, and then also they shift, new stores come up, they close. And the sunset is, I think, the moment precisely when the landscape changes the fastest, and also when a day ends, when a story ends. And it's been a space where you can project fantasies, and I like the skies to do that, just be as fantastical as possible.
Yeah, they do have that fantastical feeling, yet so many sunsets have, well, this is certainly subjective, magical feelings anyway, when it comes to like um, the colors. And as someone that looks at the colors and the miracle or the kind of like fantastical or the sublime of color in the landscape or the sky, they do magnify that. They give it like this omnipresent feeling in the way that you're using your marks. And um I just really value, even though the kind of idea, the landscape is a simplistic idea to be painting about, right? But yet, I think you're bringing like a new voice to it, and really kind of combining a lot of different elements within this strip mall and the barrenness of the strip mall, or the kind of sadness of the strip mall with the sublime of these landscapes. Uh, I wonder a little bit more about, you said you came back from to
Mhm.
LA, but you were born and raised in LA, but where were you prior?
I had gone out to the East Coast for school. I was in the I was going to RISD, and there's a program with Brown that they have. So I was studying there. I was out there for 5 years, and it was great. I mean, when I left LA, I wasn't planning on coming back, just because I was like, I grew up here. Let's see what New York is like, or what Chicago is like, or even going back to Uruguay, maybe where my family's from. But as the years passed, I got pulled back in, and it's been exciting to be back in LA. And it feels very fruitful. There's a very fruitful art scene here that I'm glad to be a part of.
Yeah, I think the last time I was there was April of 2019. My partner's father lives out there, and we were really excited about some of the new things that were happening. But I know that there's controversy in some of the areas in relationship to gentrification and pushing folks. I mean, there always is. Artists want to find cheap spaces and be able to be cultural producers, and yet that push and pull, attraction, non-traction is always a challenge. Yet I'm wondering, where is your studio in LA?
My studio is downtown. It's in the Fashion District, which is, and like I said, with these strip malls, it's a city that's constantly changing, reinventing itself. Which is something I grew up appreciating. My dad's an architect. He came here and has always talked about how the city moves, and it's exciting. And yeah, inevitably the nature of neighborhoods does change, and we're fortunate to be in a building that since the 70s or 80s has been an artist studio. As it used to be the whole floor was one artist, and now it's gotten chopped up a little bit more. But it's it's downtown Fashion District, and it's part of the city where things are really happening. Things are being made, sold, bought, and shifted around. So
Yeah, yeah. I think that's where I picked up my first fidget spinner for my daughter in the fashion districts.
probably was down in Santee Alley. I would suppose.
Yeah. That's incredible. Well, you have some work behind you, and I'd love if you could give us a little bit of a walking tour of the square foot space of your studio, just so we can see through the lens a little more detail of some of the work and some of your marksmanship and craftsmanship within the actual. Many are drawings, some paintings, correct?
Yeah, recently it's been drawing, but sure, we can hop up and take a little studio tour.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll flip the camera for this one. The studio itself, I have it broken up into space with finished works that I go back to and spend time looking at. And it's always fruitful to have older pieces such as the landscape up top, as well as newer things, projects that are experiments, so that when I am drawing, which here is mainly where I do most of my drawing, sometimes at home for smaller pieces, but definitely the bigger works in the studio. It's nice to be able to go back and forth, and definitely when I'm painting, it's nice to have a lot of works close together to be able to pull marks from one space to another. We can go look at some of the works up in the studio. This one's actually for my sister was complaining, I want one in the apartment. I want one in the apartment. She just moved to San Francisco, so but this is a kind of typical liquor store landscape that I've done recently. That is a space that exists in the real, in the kind of banal landscape, and then drifts off into the kind of fantasy that I associate with the West, with Hollywood, especially these kind of Hollywood skies. And there are some larger ones that I like to leave unfinished, spaces open. It's not always necessary for me to fill up the page when you can get an emotional resonance carrying through into an empty space. So
Yeah, negative space is really nice on that. But going back to the liquor store one, that sold?
this one did not sell. No, it goes to my sister. Yeah. So
I was eyeing that. Ooh.
yeah.
So good.
But yeah, but this came after some quicker, faster ones, which were great to just kind of get a sense of. I did these as commute drawings. My commute used to be about 40 minutes. So I would settle in and draw for 40 minutes and see how, quick I could get some little detail or feeling. And carrying that through into something a lot slower, for me, it was great because I was able to pick up on certain faster marks and quicker gestures and things like that to, layer on top of much slower drawing, and that kind of stuff has been great.
Yeah, there is that the combination of both the architectural renderings and with a chunky kind of oil pastel, it's not so easy to get the those fine lines, but then the expressive mark making that is of the sunsets, of the landscapes and all that stuff. I do appreciate that coupling.
Mm-hmm.
Really nice. And then some of the other work that you work on with the sunset stuff, and then you're also working on some of these more like planar expressions.
Yes.
That could be like Rothko-esque of sorts, or like to kind of like initial. Well, these maybe not so much, but the size and also the shapes, the ambiguity of the shapes lead to just a different invention of some of the work you're making.
I guess at this point I'll flip back around for a second. Yeah, abstraction has always been, I'm glad that you mentioned Rothko. I've always been a big Rothko fan. I mean, it's the work's incredible, and it's something I've struggled to embrace directly, but I like to think about how, especially the abstract expressionists, engage with space, engage with scenes and color, and trying to pull that into the work where I can. It has been great. It's been very fruitful also.
Yeah, I used to always, I think I had that moment of like, I love Abex. I mean, I know that it was kind of a boys' game for a really long time. And then some of the women kind of started coming out and be like, we're Abex too. And, notice us. But then, maybe I had a chip on my shoulder is what I'm saying. But I mean, I did love Rothko. I always really appreciated him from the get. Right. There were a handful of my friends that mandatory art history courses, and they would just be like, dude, I don't get it. Like color fields, it's just crap. And no matter how my vocabulary increased, and no matter how much I tried to explain the layering and the settling and the meditation and the being in the moment, using your eyes, and all these things, they still were just like that same thing. My kid can do that. So and they didn't have children at the time, but well, you didn't.
Their imaginary kid.
Right, your magic. Well, they didn't. But one of my most magical moments was at the Rothko Chapel. I think it was like 2017. Yeah, it was January 2017. I went on a spiritual kind of pilgrimage to Austin. It's in Austin, right? Yeah, and it was just they had the Tibetan Book of the Dead there, and I'm like, I'm going into a chapel, Rothko Chapel, and I'm sitting reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I couldn't have been more happy, and spent hours and hours, to the point where I was asked to can we please go now? Um, I don't know. I do really appreciate Rothko. I'm glad you do too. But there are moments in some of these paintings that you're doing with the Abex style that may reflect some of these color fields and spirituality. I'd love if you could address that a little.
Yeah, I mean, the Rothko Chapel has been there once. I wish I could go every year, but it's it's nice to also to only go once or twice maybe. And the reason those paintings in particular were so kind of revelatory for me was that they didn't just depict a landscape, or a stage, but they really became one when you were in front of it. And working at that scale is not something that I've done, but that sense of just taking color to produce a space, and not always necessarily a purely landscape or horizon line kind of thing, like that, piece up there for me is a perfect landscape, even though it's just about the color. And the emotional resonances of a space, of a color, come through in the paint in a way that, for me, you could say it's spiritual, or you could say it's kind of intuitive, or a distillation of how you're thinking just shows up when you're mixing. And there's something, that is not so academic, is just the pleasure of painting, and the special, magic, sure, of it. So.
Right. I suppose magic could be intertwined with intuition. I love talking about that a lot. With that feeling you get inside of you through color. I don't know if have you ever looked into chromiotherapy or studied the wavelength of color in relationship to healing properties?
That I can't say I've particularly looked into. No, I mean, I do know that there are, especially certain colors that are used to, what do you call it, to kind of define spaces, right? You have like hospitals will use a certain light blue or green, and restaurants use red, and that kind of very basic color produces a response thing, I think is ingrained in all of us, which is why, right, we can see more greens than anything else. That's what we grew up with. Not personally necessarily, but historically, we grew up with greens. And so those deep connections, I think, are inescapable.
Yeah, I didn't realize that we could see the most greens. That's real. That's like the primordial kind of understanding the cones in our eyes. Really? That's what
I'm fairly certain that the human eye can get more shades of green than any other color, and which is also why a lot of artists say mixing green is the hardest. Like, a guy I work with, he makes paintings that are only green, and he said he tried different colors, but that was the biggest challenge. So yeah, and it goes to show that the better you know something, the harder it is to work something good out of it too. So
yeah, and there's all sorts of like fun facts about color. I remember being younger and learning that humans evolved to see purple, and there was some sort of genetic kind of amalgamation of folks that were more evolved saw purple, and therefore purple was a color of royalty. Listen, I don't know if this is fact. I don't know if this is pure fiction. I mean, it's completely story made up. So you know, the royals would have their purple and no one would mess with them. But it did kind of come a little bit clearer when I started understanding indigo, and that indeed the cones in our eyes were really ready to see that hue. But I am really interested still in this, like this idea that, you know, the subjectivity of color, maybe, like, you know, some greens, like the way people mix greens or the way people mix your colors, for instance, I think is what I'm really attracted to. And I know many people agree that you're, you know, you're very blue centric, and, you know, there's a kind of sophistication when it comes to understanding the light of the sun or the sky and the sunset. Yeah, I guess I would really love for you to talk a little bit more about your, I mean, we talked about landscapes a little bit, but like the hue of the sunset and trying to encapsulate that, like how, what do you hope to give your viewer?
In the sunsets, in the kind of color space of them.
Yeah.
I mean, I think earlier I mentioned that the sunset is the moment in which this landscape changes the fastest, and in terms of its color shifting, which is why I really let myself go in producing color environments that are, you know, you would see them over the course of 10 minutes. And I've sat outside and people say, you use a pink that's so, you know, and you say, okay, watch for it in the sunset and it will appear. And turning the whole totality of the sunset into a single moment was a challenge. But when I really let the range and the brightness go, it felt like I could make something more accurate to the feeling of that, which I think color in the land, you mentioned indigo, you know, and the purple coming from, I think it was the crushed beetles, and blue was, you know, the most expensive colors. And I often find myself mixing colors and thinking about how they also, most of them have come out of the land, browns, you know, reds, all these come from metals. And I have a friend who has painted with actual dirt from places that are very significant in his personal history. And having that specific relationship is one thing, but pulling together all these kind of imaginary spaces where these colors come from. Sometimes I like to think and sit, this red metal might have, you know, and taking them out of various landscapes, putting them into one at the same time that you're taking a very long duration sunset and putting it into one, for me is an important part of the process. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate the fact that you acknowledge, I mean, obviously a painting is stillness, two-dimensionality, and yet the sunset is an ever-evolving share of wavelengths to our eyes. And I'm just sitting with that for a second, because that which you capture is, I mean, your choice that you're sharing with us. And it brings a cool kind of discovery too of, you're talking about pigments and their origin, and I definitely hear you on that one. It's a fascination of mine too, is like understanding. But although in architecture, when I look around at different buildings, noting the brick or the iron ore or the certain clay from Lake Superior, for instance, is the pink that was used in 1905 to 1910 for the resurgence of buildings in Chicago and New York and like all these things. And the mixing of colors. Have you ever dabbled in, like, you know, finding and crushing cobalt for the blue? Or, I mean, have you ever thought about original pigments, or like where are you just have you thought about using these kind of like old school pigments?
Yeah, I've tried it and I've tried it out, and the problem with that is that to get the color range that you can get these days at a store would be so much, it would turn it into a completely different practice for me. It would become so much more about the finding and the seeking, which is that kind of hunting for the very special moment is not necessarily something that interests me, which is why the strip malls are so nice, but rather seeing the kind of beauty or horror or whatever it may be in an everyday moment. The kinds of landscape slides I always took were quick snapshots, firing them off, just to have a lot of things to parse through. And going that specific with the colors, not being from, like a New Mexico space where the earth is actual earth and not concrete, would seem maybe a little bit off kilter for being in LA. So yeah. But
yeah, I went to a studio visit with an artist. I feel remiss to say I just can't remember her name right now. It was in Ireland, and it was an artist that was actually from Slovakia, I think, but she had traveled all over the world. Like her Fulbright was about taking land from these certain areas where she traveled. I would love to see that Fulbright application, by the way, because it sounds like a lot of fun. And then she would just like make all these clay pieces based on these locations in the land. And I've never forgotten that idea, although, the work itself wasn't as impressive than actually the challenge that it took to get out there, and the foresight that she had to be able to make all of these works in relationship to knowing clay well enough to know when it fires and how, to really cure it and make sure that it's, or to call it, make sure that it's viable for a vessel or whatever she was making.
right.
Yeah, so I asked that. It does feel really time consuming to go around, like try to grab the red clay from New Mexico or Indonesia for that matter. And,
Yeah, and I think also dealing with any material is time consuming in that it just takes a while to sort it out. And the thing about pastels, I mean, I spent a long time, and any of my friends are tired of hearing about me saying I'm trying to find the most pastel mark, this kind of, I love brutalist architecture in its hope to pull something essential out of the material. Let the concrete be the concrete, let the iron be the iron, and even dealing with something that I buy at the store, which is pre-made, trying to find what is the most pastel mark has been a whole ordeal for me. And I feel like finally I've arrived at something that I'm happy with, but I can't imagine if I had to make the pastel myself.
like go to the ends of the earth to find.
Yeah.
So your pastel, you have a particular pastel. Are you going to share your secret, or?
Do I have a particular? I have always the nice thing about pastels is that they're all pretty standardized. I can pull over here briefly to show the big piece.
Yeah.
The way the marks end up being, and I mean by the pastel mark is just the full size of it, letting it go, and just getting that angle. And they're all pretty much the same thing. I have my table here, which is full of all the kinds of brands and everything, and I try to grab as many different colors as possible, because the skies have very little mixing involved. The landscapes themselves are different, but
that separation is so juicy. And certainly the application of the oil pastel. I grew up, my sister Marie, I went to Catholic schools for 12 years, was my art teacher, Sister Marie Hernandez. And Sister Marie used to say crepa. And I think that was the brand of the oil pastel that I was using at one point in time. So I've always grown and said like this crepa. I don't know where it came from, but the oil pastel itself is so chunky. And, you get this residual relief off of it, which you're doing in the kind of separation of the non-mixing with the pastels.
The other thing I like the relation to the finger, which comes from that pressure is, or that texture is just, it's just the finger pressure. And I like that. I also like the permanence of the oil pastel. Once it hits the paper, you can try to rub it out, but you're not going to get all the color out. And there is something to be said, even in spaces where we think they're changing all the time, in the histories that are there. We were talking about the city changing and galleries moving around and things like that. The histories in those spaces stay. My interest in the landscape too comes from a lot of reading of Faulkner and working with his stuff, and the sense in which the landscape becomes definitional in your life. You're limited by it, but you're also built by it, and you can go to it to get things, and but then it takes things from you. And no matter what's happening, all those characters are rooted, and they have to live with not only their own actions, but their ancestors and the people who have come through the landscape. And the oil pastel carries that permanence in a way that I love. And
It's very thoughtful. I think this idea where the landscape certainly carries a history all by itself. Sometimes it's the humans that make it or break it, right? Yeah. Yeah. So then, Ivan, if you were to present this, a very practical question, but in keeping true to that mark making of the finger and this residual nature of the oil pastel, then would you consider, when you frame this work, like would you shadow box it? Are you going to float it? Or are you going to mount it? Are you going to push the glaze up to the...
No, and yeah, generally I've left it exposed, just kind of shadow box and a nice simple wooden thing. I forget which show I saw where there were these fantastic blood red paintings that were very much about the hand coming through, and they were in very deep wooden kind of shadow boxes, and imagining that hand coming through it felt very natural. It felt like the best way to show those things. And these aren't so much about the whole body thing, so it didn't need to be so such a big frame, but leaving it out and leaving it open is what I'd rather do.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it adds conceptually to this idea of the residual, the moment of the making, as well as the space. And the work over your left shoulder, it feels like, at least in the studio, one of the larger... Yeah, is that your left shoulder right now? I don't even know.
Yes, yeah, this one, yeah.
So this is one of the larger pieces that you've made recently, or
yeah, this is, especially in the drawings, there's one that I've made that was the same size, which I'm realizing now, there's one that was slightly smaller, but they've all been of 7-Elevens, which I realize more and more loom large in my mind, and in the city. They are kind of the...
Ooh, there you are.
Sorry, I got a spam call. They are, I don't know, there's something about the 7-Eleven that always grabs me, and it has everything that you want in a strip mall except for maybe a laundromat. So if you can get one next to a laundromat, which this one is, then you're great. So yeah, working at that scale has been nice, because I can get into the drawing a bit more, in the sense that the oil pastel, and it's something I love about it, you can only get so fine with it unless you really start shaving it with a knife to drop a little dot. And especially living in a pixel centric world, it's, things have a limit, and I think it's good to accept those things. So I don't try to go beyond the materials, limitations. And the bigger drawings, just give me more resolution, as it were. So
absolutely, it feels like a perfect trajectory for these smaller works because they are so chunky. Yeah, shaving or all the things you have to do to get fine detail, and fine detail in oil pastel is actually feels very oxymoronic. But if you're in a real painterly way and you're gonna throw some turpentine on there, then I get it. But then why are you gonna once you paint, just use a brush, it's kind of, I don't know, oil pastels isn't exactly like the go-to for a lot of folks all the time. Well, at least maybe, I was younger, I really appreciated oil pastels. Like I was saying, Sister Marie really helped me learn how to wield them, and I felt that they were really functional. But why are you using that medium, or like what is it about those? I mean, you talked about the residual kind of nature of them. Is it just like access, or what about the brush? Or are you kind of like letting go of it? It's just this kind of a movement that you're changing?
when I paint, I mean, the other side of the studio over here, which we didn't spend, is painting
That's
is
fine. It's now our time to start with painting.
sure, we can, I mean, and it's funny that you mentioned painting and the oil pastels, because when I use the oil pastels in paintings, which I do rather frequently, it's in a much different way. It becomes, that it isn't the center of the work in a kind of, I want to say, emotional centering. So it becomes more of a tool in the sense that a brush is. But here we can go to, these are some painting. They're on paper just because, I wanted to get off some. I haven't painted in a while. I wanted to get off some fast paintings. And coming from the very chunky approach of the oil pastel, I've let myself work these in a much rougher kind of way. And this was after I had just driven maybe a month ago, I drove some art to Montana for work. It was a shuttle, and getting back out into the landscape, which I hadn't done in a few years, really made me want to paint again, in a way that coming back to LA with the drawings made me want to deal with the city again. But these are beginnings of bigger works. But they come from, and this is something I mentioned before, they come from my very high-tech slide holding device. I have all these slides, and I don't know if it's possible how well people can see, but they're very basic kind of simple images. And I pick them up and they get translated into something that tries to carry the emotional resonance of it, not necessarily a one-to-one depiction of what exactly is going on. So these are what I'm working on, as well as the drawings. But
one of our guests, Hunter, is saying that this deep red, larger landscape right here, if we can move in a little closer to that.
Yeah.
Striking, they say.
This one is also the beginning stages of it, but this is the four horsemen of the apocalypse, as it were. This is from a shot of Mount Rushmore, which I love because you can see from the bottom of it, all the stone, they just kind of left the trash from the carving, which is something that when you look at the bigger tourist shots, you never really see. And I guess I hadn't thought of it about as a blood red, but I can see how that would come from it. But anyway, yeah, that's.
So I can talk to us a little bit about, like, what are your ideas in completing that painting? Where is it in work in progress?
It's pretty early on, yeah. And while I like to start them fast, the paintings definitely, they come together a lot slower. And it's been something that's always been the case with painted works, is that things get laid down and things get built, and how they get finished is a much slower reflective process, which is, I call it action painting, in the sense that I sit and I look at it and then it's a quick thing. But those last steps, are like the last puzzle pieces. They happen quickly, but it takes a while to get there.
Yeah. And you have these works. You're in LA. Have you any exhibitions coming up, or things that may have been canceled during COVID, or how are you faring in terms of the marketplace? I mean, we're happy to have you on Artfare. Hopefully, you get some studio visits, and and masks and social distance and blah blah blah. But I'm just wondering, do you have any future projects lined up?
Right now, I don't. There's always a lot of talk with different people, which there was definitely a lull at the beginning of everybody kind of distancing and not sure what safety protocols were, and I think that the learning process has been good. Definitely having some studio visits, masked and everything, but the FaceTime studio visits have been great too, because it's been able to connect me with people who, they saw something on Artfare, they send me an email, they say, hey, could I look around the studio, talk to you, and you talk for half an hour, and
That's awesome.
then they, end up taking something home, and that's been great. Not only in terms of selling things, but also in terms of just being able to talk to people that otherwise
Yeah.
might have never been able to, stop by. And even this is a kind of new thing that I'm glad is happening. So, yeah.
Yeah. Um, Definitely love doing studio visits, and I miss a lot the human to human interaction, just being in the space, being able to see the work in real time, real life. Yet, I mean, I suppose my eyes are like in this weird science fiction video, kind of like bending the light so I can actually maybe make out what it looks like in real life. I mean, always the best documentation breeds, some of the most warranted kind of attention or not. Like, I don't know. I just wonder if you have any comments on, like, the documentation of work in relationship to COVID right now, and kind of the place where artists are, where folks aren't able to see things in real life. Are you I guess the first question is, like, thinking about documentation, how have you been documenting your work? Do you do it yourself, or do you have other friends or professionals that help you?
Yeah, I'm lucky to have a few friends who do a lot of freelance photography and are very good at it. And so they'll come by and do some documentation once I have a batch of works to get stuff out. I got an email actually from Artfare saying you need a newer phone, and so I did that to get a better camera. Or it wasn't an email, it was in the description, use something.
Oh, yeah.
But that digital to real is, I think, something that happens that it's hard. I think often if you see something online that you like, in person it will be different, but it's rare that you cease to like it. You just, different things happen. And I think that, you learn to appreciate a piece differently in person or online. So,
Yeah, you really do. The
yeah.
the works that I mean, I've seen works in real life and I've seen them documented, and I'm very disappointed. And then I've seen works documented and I'm just really excited, and then to see them in real life and I'm very disappointed. I mean, it kind of goes both ways.
That happens occasionally, yeah, but
um, yeah, there's this level of we talked a lot to many artists throughout the Thursdays, and in particular Casey Jeffers. Last week we were kind of talking about, he's a photographer, and he was just kind of talking about how like it leveled the playing field. And it's so funny because he was using the exact same words as I have been using about, you know, artists that, or galleries that are at a certain level that just all of a sudden can basically play with the big cats because of the level of professionalism in their online presentation.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
very exciting.
Yeah. I mean, it's the online viewing rooms were a great way to keep abreast of, you know, it's hard to see new artists, but it was really nice to see people whose work I'd seen before and see how it was changing. But once a lot of the galleries in LA are open by appointment, and that's been, you know, as soon as that happened, I was like, I'm back there. And it's really nice to be the only person in a space. You can really spend time with the work in a way that, I mean, in some ways, I hope that stays. I hope you know, after COVID, I can still book a half hour and just go see, you know, just me and the work. And if I'm lucky, someone there to talk about it. But
Totally. I went gallery hopping this week in the city, and that was precisely what I was thinking. Oh my gosh, I'm the only person in Lehman Maupin right now looking at this um Teresita Fernandez, I believe, show. And then I went to go see the Theaster Gates show at Gagosian, and we were the only people in there. And it was
wow.
profound how beautiful it was. Gosh, Yossi Milo, like we were able to see. I mean, it was unlike any other viewing experience. I actually felt like I was a VIP person walking in and saying like, "Hey." A couple of really great shows at Miles McHenry. Just, you know, it was just a little Chelsea hop, and Boyski didn't have a lot of appointments. Well, we had like 4 appointments, but then otherwise everyone just accepted us. I have to tell you, I don't know if they're doing this in LA, but they have like the state of the art equipment. Clearly, we're talking about blue chip galleries right now, but like state of the art equipment where you just like walk up and it's an iPad and just like bing, bing, take your temperature, take your facial recognition. Oh, you can have your mask on, no worries. And then they're like, go ahead, fill out this form. Oh, here you are, all the things.
Some of them, yeah, some of them have that. Most places have the little temperature
Done.
blaster thing, yeah. So
I know I was well, you know, if that's the way we have to look at art in real life, then I guess that's what we're doing right now. And it's okay. One of the things I was noticing too is that people are really gung-ho about having all the checklists and QR codes, and having all of the press releases and QR codes. And anyway, this may be more revealing than I probably that's necessary, but I collect press releases and paper and like have this whole file, like archive of the shows that I've seen based on the fact that I'm an art writer and curator. So I really like going back to my binders and being like, who was that I saw then? And so now only doing QR codes. I know Mother Earth is mad at me for thinking this, but I'm just like really nostalgic for them.
yeah, I mean, I think it's strange that you know, that one being alone in the gallery space with the art is maybe more so how most artists think about maybe not a show, but one piece at a time, is that you're engaging at it. But then, yeah, then to having the paper instead of having your phone, it used to be nice because it was just the marker of a different experience, a different mindset. Um, and the press releases can be, there was a show at Moscow's Beige that I went to recently where Rachel Browning's press release was on a piece of, she drives and takes these set up photographs and stuff. And there's a lot of, you know, outdoor feeling in the way the show's talked about it. And it was printed on something that's like a survival paper. You can't tear it, you can't wet it, you can't do anything to it. And holding that in your hand while you're walking through the show, looking at these photographs, made a very different, it gave a very different context to it. And, you know, that is something that you can't get online.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I'm born raised in the 70s, early 80s, so I'm a real analog file. of all counts. And it's just my unfortunate middle age that's getting me, all nostalgic as well. The Yeah, but the fact that we're able to get out there and kind of see some real stuff, I hope that there's a show for you in the very near future where folks can actually take this work in real life and see it with whatever wall color you choose. I am wondering from our audience, I know you've had some very fantastic patients, guests listening tonight. If there are any questions, I would love to have you chat it up in the text box or ask. I'd be happy to answer anything, but I don't know if,
Yeah, that'd be great.
yeah, Ivan, is there anything else that you'd like to say? And we're coming up in we got 8 minutes left. And so I was just kind of close it up a little bit.
I mean, I think if anybody has any, further questions, that'd be great. I need to move the phone here to be able to get to the messages, but yeah, I think, I'm glad to have a pretty thorough walkthrough of what's going on in the studio. It's always nice to, every time you show it and talk about it, you rethink it, and that kind of thinking through doing, which is so much of making stuff, is it's always great. So I'm glad to, talk to anybody who has any questions.
Yeah. Oh, Hunter, can you speak more to the poetry that accompanies your work online? This is a great question because your writing is exquisite. I was diving into it earlier.
Thank you. Yeah, I would hope. I hope it's good if I still leave it up there. Yeah, reading for me. I mean, reading for me is always huge. It's always been a big part of what gets me thinking about spaces, and as well as the same way that I'm interested in residues in the landscape. The poems online come from the residues of reading. It's just the markings and notations in books so often that I buy used just because it's cheaper and easier and nice to see somebody else's way of reading, and pulling out that text is how those poems were produced. And so they serve kind of as fragments of the text and new superimpositions. So you're welcome, Hunter.
One of the questions I had was about the movement of your line, and I was curious, have you ever thought about animation? I know these are still images, yet they feel so in motion, and therefore, have you dabbled in animation at all, or would you consider?
I would, accept that I kind of came at the landscape and the sunset through it, in the sense that what really settled me into painting landscapes and thinking about the landscape, and especially the movement of the landscape, was My Own Private Idaho, the Gus Van Sant movie with River Phoenix, and all those other landscapes. The old paintings are these love letters to River Phoenix. But what really struck me was the way that the dream sequences are these still shots of a very fast-paced, moving sky landscape. And part of my hope in painting is to get that same feeling. So it would kind of be, reinventing the wheel to go back to, I know what that film would look like, and I'm glad somebody else already did it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, so I know that both of these images, I have a question from Ernesto. I might have missed this, but what are the painters you're looking at right now?
Well, in terms of, there's a lot of contemporary painters that there's a lot of painters who paint in a very different way than the way that I paint, but whose work I love. So Celeste Dupuy Spencer, whose new work, I mean, just the way that she deals with, you know, paint and how it relates to the emotional resonance of a space is killer for me. And it's, you know, it's not the kind of stuff I paint, but it's something I look to think about painting. Sky Volmar, the way that the drawing Sky makes deal with the material in such a serious, there's such a serious relationship with the material and how it produces a subject and a painting or a drawing or is something that I love as well. But then, you know, then I have my books that I flip through. I've been going back to Cezanne's portraits, as well as a lot of Anselm Kiefer's early landscapes. So that's kind of what I'm looking at now.
Mm-hmm. One of the someone else is asking Kathitz or Kathitz. Thank you always for joining, Kathitz. You're very supportive. I'm very happy to have you. Do you have any shows lined up in LA in 2021? I'd like to see your work in person. And we kind of discussed this. We got to manifest. Some more
I as of right now, I do not know. A couple of people that I'm talking with, but you know, never get to count your chickens before they hatch. So hopefully, if it's in the latter part of the year, we can not only see them in person, but see each other in person as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think they're projecting some real openings, fairs opening.
Yeah.
In fall of 2021. I don't think they're even like maybe Basel, Switzerland, maybe June. Who knows? We got a couple more questions. Are there any explicitly theoretical influences that you found yourself drawn to recently? Asks Will Weatherly.
Recently, this is a fun. Will knows all my old theoretical influences, but recently has been, you know, I mean, thinking through the political reality, you know, not in any kind of specific policy or thing, but in terms of how people have been talking about politics as this show and, you know, full of characters, and in a way that's kind of disappointing for a lot of people I know who are looking for real specific things. The thinking on that has, I don't know, made me approach the landscape in a different way. It's the cityscape specifically, especially considering that they're supposed to be paintings of America, even though they're paintings of Los Angeles, and has me thinking a lot about Hollywood sunsets. You know, what does it mean to be living in a fantasy space, especially when politics is so much about projection and fantasy these days. So maybe that's not a very satisfying theory heavy answer, but I hope that
thoughts there. I mean, there's so much to kind of unpack in that relationship, because I think for years we're going to be undoing the societal trauma that we've had over the last 4 years. And I know that there's been societal trauma for the last 400 years. You know, we're always ripe to readdress and refigure how we look at the world. And I think that artists definitely right now are impacting other people's understanding of how to view the world, and the way artists are able to really dedicate their. Hank Willis Thomas said something like just recently, and it was so beautiful. He said something along the lines like, all artists are prophets, all artists are psychic and can intuit like the idea of what is not just coming, but what we need to look at. I'm paraphrasing. And I bring that to the table right now as we're closing up, just because that's what we're here for. We're here to understand how to see things differently, and maybe with hope and optimism, but maybe with like morbidity. I don't know. But
I think that's a high bar for an artist, but I think that it's better to have a high bar than, you know, a lower one. And
sure.
it's, you do encounter things that make you look at the world differently, and those, that does not always happen every time you run into art, but it happens often enough that you know it can happen, and that is something that keeps me in the studio, definitely. You know, knowing that it's possible, but that it's elusive. Yeah.
Yeah. And we can never be so confident. We can only just trust.
Yeah.
So we're at 1900 hours at this point, which means Eastern time, because I know you took your time today. Thank you so much for taking the time today. In your bright lit studio in California hours. It's been so great talking to you, Ivan. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's been really great. Thank you very much. And thanks for everybody who, you know, tuned in and had questions, and, you know.
That's right. Everyone who tuned in, super appreciate it. If you missed anything, it'll be up on our YouTube channel for Artfare very soon. Also, Ivan's work is on the app, and it's awesome, and it's very reasonably priced. And I could like go in there and snatch for Christmas presents or something like this. But I really hope to meet you in person one day, Ivan. Thank you so much for doing and for sharing this time and insight with us. I wish you very happy holidays.
Thank you. Yeah, and likewise. And if anybody, you know, shoot me an email or on the app or whatever. Happy to keep talking to anybody. So
Definitely.
great.
All right, y'all. Peace out.
Thank you.